So hello and welcome again, all of my star pupils, to the final video that we have for my Halloween series. I am a little sad, you guys. I did post this on Instagram that this is going to be the last one as part of the Halloween series, and I was sad because these videos have been so much fun to make for you guys. I did want to thank everyone who did like and subscribe to a lot of the videos. Also, too, what's interesting about this video is that we're ending it on a more positive note. We're ending it basically doing the history of Halloween, which, surprise, surprise, some of you were not surprised by that. But there's a reason for me doing that. So we're going to talk a little bit today about the history of Halloween. Why did Halloween come about? That sort of thing. And then for the second part of this video, I am actually going to be filming on Halloween. And the second part of this video is going to be another cooking and cocktail video because you guys seem to really like that. I'm going to be doing all the theme of A Nightmare Before Christmas. So again, if you guys are interested in seeing that video, please hit the like button and subscribe to this channel so that you can actually get the notification when that's going to be coming out. I'm going to try and post it on Saturday the same time that I actually do it. Because we're kind of running out of time with the holiday coming up so soon and everything of that nature. I'm also going to post a small video, you guys, of my do-it-yourself moon water that we made in the previous video for the history of werewolves. If you haven't seen that, I will link it down below. So go ahead and check that video out. And check out some of the other videos for the crafts that we did and things of that nature too. But I will be posting that video so you guys can see it of the DIY moon water that we did make and everything like that. So let's get into this video. So there is the history of Halloween. So we all know that in the United States of America, we celebrate Halloween specifically on October 31st. This year, it's going to be on October 31st, 2020. It will be on a Saturday. It's very much a tradition in the United States, although you can also find this tradition in different aspects around the world. I know that Halloween is also celebrated in Canada. I also do know that there is obviously the Day of the Dead that's celebrated in Mexico, in South America, that type of thing, which we'll get into that in a little bit. So talking about Halloween, how did this whole tradition kind of start from the very beginning? So basically, Halloween is a very old traditional holiday. It generated many centuries ago. And basically how it started was that it was a Celtic festival. So we talked a lot about in the history of witches, the whole pagan aspect of things, the Celtic traditions, things like that. So Halloween generated back then. So what this Celtic tradition was called was Samhain. Now Samhain is actually spelled S-A-M-H-A-I-N, and I can definitely link that down below, you guys. So Samhain is basically they called it the Harvest Festival. So basically you have to understand that the harvest was a very big time in people's lives back then, with food, with gathering, with things of that nature, just to survive the winter. So if you had a very good harvest in the winter, you were considered blessed or gifted or things of that nature. So what people would do basically is they believe that because around this time it was the thinnest veil between the living and the dead, many of these Celtic people believed that in evil spirits and things like that. Obviously, you have the fall turning into the winter. Winter is a time where everything is dead, that type of thing. So what they used to do is to ward off evil spirits from their crops, from their families, from their medicinal herbs and things of that nature that they would grow. They would often have near Halloween, or All Hallows Eve, as they called it, they would have ceremonial bonfires. They would have a lot of fire. Fire was a very big thing also too, because it wards off evil spirits. It gives warmth in the darkness. It gives light in the darkness. So a lot of these bonfires were used around Halloween. And basically what Celtic tradition would do is that everyone would dress up in different costumes or different looking costumes. A lot of them were looking mostly like animal interpretations, and we talked a lot about that in the history of werewolves. A lot of animal interpretations were used. A lot of devil costumes were worn to kind of ward off evil spirits or to trick the evil spirits into leaving the plantations, into leaving these places where people would grow crops. Oftentimes the Celtic traditions were also held where on this holiday people would go through the crops and be dressed in these different costumes so that the evil spirits would get confused and leave. So that's kind of where you get the costume sort of tradition that we have now in Halloween. Obviously, it's no surprise that we light pumpkins. We have a lot of lights going on during Halloween. The orange and the black colors, that's another tradition. Orange was used as a type of purity, a type of color to kind of ward off evil spirits. Obviously black using that the dark of night, that type of thing. So you get a lot of this in the lighting of the bonfires and lighting of that type of thing, because they wanted to put light into the fields. Oftentimes too, in the fields, they would set up small bonfires around the fields because they believed that that would protect the crops from the evil spirits, things of that nature. So we talk a lot about the veil, the thinning of the life and death situation. So what's also interesting too is that ghosts are a very prominent thing in Halloween. They're a prominent thing because most of the time Halloween and Samhain was used to celebrate those loved ones who had passed on. It was a tradition similar to the way that the Day of the Dead is observed in in South America. So in parts of Central America as well too, in Mexico, in Texas, things of that nature, some people will celebrate the Day of the Dead. So you have that thing of skeletons, of ghosts, the body decomposing, that type of thing. So ghosts were very prevalent too. Now, the interesting thing about this is that ghosts were not depicted as you would see with the white and the transparent. Ghosts were often perceived as being darker in color, just dark masses, that type of thing. So with this whole warding off from the crops, it's interesting too, because during Samhain, a lot of times people, including farmers, things of that nature, going back centuries, would use this time to pay off their debts. So if you had a very good harvest, you would be considered to have, able to pay off your debts and have basically a clean slate. Thus, the reason why around this time of October 31st, this would be considered the new year for a lot of the Celtic people. Unlike how we have New Year's Eve in the United States on, December 31st, we have New Year's Eve, and then you go into New Year's Day. Basically, for the Celtic people, it was October 31st into November 1st, because it would be the start of a new year essentially, which makes sense because the harvest time would end around that time period. So in the winter time, it would just be, surviving off of whatever you had for the harvest. So there's a couple of other things about Halloween that are interesting. And what's interesting about this is we have this notion of November 1st as being All Saints Day, the Day of the Dead, that type of thing. And again, that veil from October 31st to November 1st is very prevalent because that's the time when you can communicate with spirits, communicate with your ancestors. A lot of people believe that this tradition of Halloween started as a way to communicate with those who are no longer present in this world, and things of that nature. So what was interesting is back then, Halloween was called All Hallows Eve, basically. It was not called Halloween until much, much later. We're talking the 1920s, the 1900s was when it was started to become called Halloween instead of All Hallows Eve, because it made it more modern, and we'll get into that in a little bit soon. So Halloween has mostly been linked to the wearing of the costumes, which we explained with Samhain, the trick-or-treating, the embracing things of like the dead and things of that nature. So what's interesting about trick-or-treating is a couple things. Trick-or-treating did not start until the 1950s. It didn't become a very prevalent thing until the late 1940s and early 1950s. The reason for this being is because of the fact that when we talk about trick-or-treating, we talk about the trick part with Samhain Samhain when they used to wear the costumes to trick the evil spirits. But we talk about the treating part as well, which is interesting because that is an offering that you are giving to someone. So these offerings were often given back in the Celtic times to the people who had passed on. The Celtics would bring, bread. Bread is a very prevalent thing. Bread represented the body a lot of times, or they would bring different foods, and you can see that even during the Day of the Dead in, the South American cultures too, Mexico, that type of thing. They would be bringing these treats to their ancestors, to their passed on loved ones, to still have that type of connection and to have that good luck for the future moving onward. You can also see this in Eastern traditions too, where they would be giving offerings to the ancestors or offerings to people who have passed on. So we get the idea of treating from that type of tradition. And in the 1950s, this became even more prevalent because you would have the smaller communities. Children would dress up and go to different neighbors, go to different houses. And the thing is that you were supposed to provide a treat for the children, because if you didn't, then most of the time you'd have your house toilet paper egged, things of that nature as part of the trick thing. So you would have to give children a treat. Now, back in the 1950s, how things changed was that most of the treats were actually handmade. Mostly you would be getting things from neighbors, like the candied apples or different type of fudges that were made mostly. Where what's interesting is that Hershey was very prevalent back then too. Now we talk about the candy companies. So when Hershey was very, very prevalent, they saw this need of, trick-or-treating. So Hershey developed candy for those who couldn't make their own edible treats. So that's how candy became so popular to give to children. So you saw that with Hershey creating, all of the little mini Hershey bars and creating Reese's and creating all these different candies. And then you see people like Mars start to get in. So that's how Hershey really developed that for people who couldn't make their own home cooked goods. And now we realize that obviously that's not as much of a prevalent thing. So when we get into this whole thing about the trick-or-treating, treating's also interesting too, because there was a lot of urban legends that started to, like I said before, with a lot of these stories, somebody makes them up and someone takes them, runs with them. So back in the late 1950s, early 1960s, for trick-or-treating, the reason why trick-or-treating with the homemade baked goods became less prevalent is because most people would claim that when they would come home, they would find, razor blades in their candy apples, or, there was the grand story of arsenic being put into cookies by one neighbor. These type of things actually were occurring more and more in the early 60s into the, middle of the 60s. So a lot of people refrained because of these urban legends from making homemade baked goods and things of that nature. So we mostly nowadays give out candy or things that are safer for kids to have for Halloween. So what's also interesting about Halloween is the concept of Halloween parties. So what's interesting is that trick-or-treating didn't really become that prevalent until the 1950s. Prior to that, people would have Halloween parties in their own homes. Now, what's interesting about this is with the Halloween parties, they were created mostly to have people in a gathering, things of that nature. You'd have the communal punch, that type of thing. So people would do this, and often some people would wear costumes, some people wouldn't, but people just trusted it more because especially with going out at night and things of that nature, people didn't live that close together in the communities. And up until the 1900s, many people before then thought that All Hallows Eve was a serious holiday, that type of thing. You have the carving of jack-o'-lanterns to ward off spirits, this type of thing. So in the 1900s, it became prevalent to have these type of at-home parties. A lot of times these Halloween parties would actually be seances. They would be things to, reenact an ancestor, someone who had passed on, communicate with spirits, that type of thing. You also had the Halloween parties where people believed that there were some superstitions that were, attached to this. For example, you would have the bobbing of apples. So how did bobbing of apples come about? It's no longer that children do this, but adults. So a lot of times at these Victorian parties, bobbing for apples would be a competitive thing, mostly for women, because women would actually try and gain a husband out of this, which is interesting. So you would basically be bobbing for apples, and whoever could get the apple, that would kind of discern that she would be married next. So there is also that. There's another tradition with bobbing for apples that basically if you did bob for the apple, the woman would then basically begin to peel the apple before she consumed it, and then she would throw the apple behind her over her left shoulder. You get a lot of that whole situation with throwing salt over your left shoulder. A lot of traditions believe that that's a way of luck or a superstition. So you would take the apple peel, throw it over your shoulder, and then behind you, apparently, the initial of who you were supposed to marry would be shown, apparently, from bobbing for apples. There's also this other common conception during the Victorian parties that any time that you would basically be peeling an apple, you would set it in some water, and that also too would give you the initial of your person that you were supposed to marry, or you would be able to see it more clearly in the water, water being a conduit. So a lot of times these Victorian parties were used to either find husbands, they were used to have just the frolicking, things like that, and children were not even really thought of at these parties, because a lot of times at these parties it would mostly be for adults, that type of thing. Children didn't become extremely prevalent in these parties until 1950s, when you had the trick-or-treating. They would probably do things for children in the Victorian age, but it wasn't anything like it was in the 50s and onward. And the candy companies would often refer to children. They would make these type of assumptions with children for candy, things of that nature. Their ads with trick-or-treating and that sort of thing. The other interesting thing about the Victorian situation is that we often refer to the urban legend of Bloody Mary, that basically you stare in the mirror on Halloween night and you say Bloody Mary 3 times and she just magically appears. Well, this actually came from the Victorian tradition, that what women would do on Halloween is that they would stand in front of a mirror with a candle held up to closer to their face, and they would look into the mirror and recite something 3 times. And basically, if they were looking for the face of their husband, if they were looking for something of that nature, then they would then gaze into the mirror and be able to see the face of their husband. So this idea of mirrors being used a lot too in Halloween, or this type of, we get the urban legend of Bloody Mary, but then obviously that came from the tradition of Halloween when you would do that at night. So the Victorian age was mostly about the Halloween parties, those type of traditions. We talked about the history of jack-o'-lanterns and pumpkins and how those came to be, but Halloween has not always been what we see it as today. You got introduced to all the different monsters, to, witches, to things that are otherworldly as time had progressed from the 1960s onward. So you also have Halloween as being a tradition. So what's interesting about this is there is a petition currently online, all my star pupils. This is insane. There has been so many people who have signed this petition to make Halloween a national holiday. There's been so many people, meaning that you would get off from work, all this and that. And this petition's been going on for many years, that people had tried to petition the federal government to make it an actual holiday. What's interesting is Halloween is considered a tradition. It is not considered an actual holiday or a federal holiday, where you would actually get the time off. So who knows, maybe if in our near future that this could be a situation where people would be getting time off for the holiday. It's interesting because Congress states the reason why they don't have it off for the holiday is because it's a tradition, and because Halloween is rich in a religious type of sense, meaning that it's often referred to as a pagan situation, the Celtics, things like that. And because primarily back then most people would be very religious, that's the reason why Congress doesn't have it as a national holiday, because it has religious kind of undertones or things of that nature, which I kind of thought was interesting when I found this in my travels, that it's more considered a tradition. So you don't need to celebrate Halloween Halloween, you know, that type of thing. A lot of people nowadays have more fall festivals or things of that nature because some people just aren't into the tradition like they used to be. So that was kind of interesting as well. Also with Halloween, there are over 179 million Americans today that celebrate Halloween, that celebrate the traditions of trick-or-treating, going out at night, that type of thing. And also too, they spend about $9.1 billion on it per year, and that is not including costumes. Most of that 9.1 billion comes from the candy companies. It comes from those companies where you are buying candy and treats for Halloween. There is over a ton. Back in the 1950s, there was not that many candy companies who would devote their time to Halloween. Hershey kind of trailblazed that a little bit for people because they saw a need to have that. You know, they started doing Halloween displays and things like that. But nowadays you have a ton of different candy companies that will literally invest millions of dollars into ads, into making candy, into making all these little party packs for kids and things like that. What's also interesting is that nowadays versus back in the day, a lot of people are reverting to things that are not candy related either, kind of like the 1950s reverting back to like giving out little treats like pencils or little, you know, activity books. There's a lot of kids who have allergies now, things like that, but it's just so interesting that most of that amount is dedicated to candy and to the treats. It's not even dedicated to Halloween decorations. I also looked up online that a lot of people, Halloween decorations have become a bigger thing now than they ever were back in the 50s and the 60s. You know, Halloween, there are some people who put on all day Halloween displays. I mean, like haunted houses, you guys, like things of that nature. And that 9.1 billion isn't even half of that. It's mostly for the candy. So that's also interesting too. You know, we talk about Halloween decorations. What's interesting is that Halloween decorations did not become prevalent until the 70s. With the garland, with things of that nature. Back then in the 50s and 60s, it would mostly be scarecrows or witch faces or ghosts or pumpkins would be prevalent. But now you have all of the monsters being more prevalent, things that are darker being prevalent. And in the 70s is when people used to start the haunted hayrides and those big displays. Lights were also a little bit more prevalent in the 70s and 80s than in the past times. In a lot of the 50s and 60s for decorations outside, people would use candles, things of that nature. I mean, obviously you can see where that could go wrong, but still a lot of people in the 70s and 80s started to use the lights and decorations and things like that outside. And just how much Halloween has evolved since back then it's pretty interesting to think about. For a holiday that isn't considered an actual holiday, it's interesting that this tradition has just become so monumentous in many people's lives that over, you know, 179 million of us are celebrating it is very interesting because this has been, you know, a phenomenon that has just reached and you can find it in different cultures, you guys, which I told you about with the history of like most of the monsters, witches. This is not something that's exclusive to the United States. It's something that's all around us, all over the place, just in different type of traditions. Things of that nature. But the very fact that Hershey, the candy company, started all of the trick-or-treat, started that, and then other people were getting involved in it too. It's interesting that they saw that type of need. So basically that's the gist of the history of Halloween. You know, different things that you can find online about the history of Halloween, why we use the colors that we do, that type of thing. The other interesting thing about this is that we can talk about one of the most popular Halloween movies besides the horror movies that is ever played every year. And that is The Nightmare Before Christmas. So we touched upon Hocus Pocus a little bit, and I talked about how Hocus Pocus was released at of time because it didn't want to compete with The Nightmare Before Christmas. The Nightmare Before Christmas was released in October of 1993. What is so interesting about The Nightmare Before Christmas is that this story has endured for a long time since then. You know, a lot of people in the 90s, if you're like myself who grew up in the 90s, you are referring to this movie, you know what this movie is. So The Nightmare Before Christmas was created by Tim Burton, who is a very huge director. I'm sure that many of my star pupils have seen some of his stuff. So The Nightmare Before Christmas kind of details in the story about Jack Skellington, who goes and visits Christmas Town and then decides to take over Christmas and, you know, kidnap Santa Claus and do this whole entire thing. And then throughout the movie, you can see all the different characters, the music. The music in this is very prevalent because a lot of people still remember the songs. They still remember a lot of the soundtrack to pieces. Danny Elfman composed a lot of the music in this movie, things of that nature. So what's great about this movie is that it contrasts a lot of what any person would imagine Halloween would be like. Halloween Town is just so graphic, and everything that you see there, even though it's a cartoon, many people believed back in 1993, because Disney actually made The Nightmare Before Christmas, but they put the Touchstone banner on it because they were worried that it was too, you know, frightening for kids. But now kids love it because it's graphic enough for them, but they can still understand the concept. So what's interesting, a little trivia about this movie, is that Tim Burton created this movie actually from a poem that he was out shopping for his children. And he was shopping and he had noticed how quickly things were changing from Halloween to Christmas. So you have people who are like, why are they putting Christmas stuff out in the middle of, you know, October? Well, he kind of got that idea and then he wrote a poem about Jack Skellington taking over Christmas, which obviously, you know, that was years prior to when this movie was made in 1993. And then he started to write the story about it. He wanted this movie to be made for many, many years. And what's interesting is Disney actually used CG motion action. This is the first ever movie that had that, that was an animated movie from Disney. Most of the times it would just be, you know, the motion acted, but it would be like a different situation. So with this, he kind of composed this whole entire story, things of that nature, and you can see the stark contrast between, you know, Christmas Town and Halloween Town and how they're very, very much different. And you can see the traditions of Halloween even in the movie too. So what's great about this too is the characters. The characters stand out the most in this movie mostly. And what's interesting is that you have, you know, this movie made a lot of money the first time that it opened up because it was so different, because the director Henry Selick used a lot of different props and used different things to kind of make it look more realistic, and with the, you know, with the animation and things like that. And it took a long time to actually make the movie too. So we talk about, you know, the characters. We talk about Jack Skellington. You know, Sally is very prominent. They make her look kind of like a voodoo rag doll, which I think was really interesting. And then you have Oogie Boogie in it, who's like comprised of bugs and things of that nature. So it kind of brings like a lot of these creepy characters into Christmas Town, which is the complete and total opposite. You have Santa Claus and the elves and everything like that. And it's just interesting to see Jack Skellington taking over Christmas and what they do, like if Christmas and Halloween were combined together. It's just interesting to see that in the movie. So this is primarily a Halloween movie. It's very festive for the Halloween season. I mean, I feel like The Nightmare Before Christmas now has become even more popular because, you know, we're all grown up now. People who were living in the 90s who watched this as children, your kids are watching it now. Like, it's different. So it's the same thing with Hocus Pocus, but just different. This has become more prevalent. It is owned by Disney. The movie is still owned by Disney. There's a lot of things with trivia where it says who takes credit for it really. Is it Tim Burton? Is it Henry Selick because he directed it? This whole type of thing. In my opinion, because Tim Burton created this from a poem, I would say that that's his thing, like most of the time. But Disney does own the rights to the movie, so if you haven't had a chance to see it, you know, definitely check it out. So we're doing this because it is a culmination of Halloween. It is a culmination of Christmas, but mostly we're doing it because it's, you know, Halloween based and things of that nature. So what I'm planning to do for my second part of this video is, you guys were so loving the vampire, you know, video where I made food and made cocktails. You guys were all telling me that you love that. So I'm like, okay, let me do this again. So for this time, we're actually going to be making 3 different shots. And I'm not going to tell you guys what the shots are because that would not be fair to everybody. We're also going to be making, you know, a dessert, and I want to try and make a pizza this time, you guys, because I feel like last time a lot of people were giving me comments that it was that, you know, you want something quicker basically. So I can kind of understand that it's Halloween, you know, that type of thing. So we're going to be making our own pizza, you know, if you're not comfortable with buying it or something of that nature. So please stay tuned for that. But as always, you know, definitely like and subscribe. Again, I will be posting the DIY moon water that you guys have been asking me to do. I'm going to set that out on Halloween so that it can charge and things of that nature. But I hope that you guys at least got something out of the history of Halloween, and we'll be talking more about The Nightmare Before Christmas in my other video that we're going to do. I'll pull out some more trivia and things from that as well. But as always, you know, keep it light, keep it bright, keep it starry. And if you do want to, definitely check out my Instagram, you guys, or like and subscribe to this video. My Instagram, I post stuff on there. What I'm thinking of doing is for the month of November, for all my Scorpios out there, I'm going to definitely post a Scorpio birthday zodiac video. I'm going to start to do on Instagram something that I've been seeing from a lot of other people, and I'm going to do generalized daily card readings every morning to kind of see like what's going on for that morning or that type of thing. And I think we're going to be progressing with the channel by doing more 101s, that type of thing. So again, if you guys are interested in that, comment down below. If you're not interested and you want to see something else for the month of November, comment down below either way. But again, it was good to see you guys, and I hope to see you for part 2. Bye.